Hello, everyone, and welcome to another one of the series in our creativity track. So before I introduce our exciting new guest, Madelyn Kent, I just want to invite and welcome those of you who are new to take a moment to look at your screen and find where on your screen the chat function is. It's an opportunity for you to check in with other people, introduce yourself, become part of the community. So I'd like to take this time now to welcome somebody, a fellow writer, Feldenkrais practitioner, who has taken the work of the Feldenkrais method into the world of creativity. And Madelyn Kent is a writer. Many of her plays have been produced all over the world, including at Soho Rep. She was a professor at NYU at the Tisch School and has gone on to create a series of different kinds of workshops and trainings that specifically help people access their creativity through a somatic experience. So welcome, Madelyn Kent, to our summit. It's really great to see you. You're coming to us from Tel Aviv now, right?
That's right. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
So I'm going to jump right into it, Madelyn. What makes you creative? What do you think makes you creative?
For me, I think it's about constantly looking for connections between different states of being, and being frustrated in my desire to find those connections, and finding connections in surprising ways. So I feel like a lot of times my creativity is set up by frustrations. So I might have things that I'm curious about, that I explore, that certain pathways are being suggested to me on certain levels that I might not even be aware of. And then I might go down a pathway that isn't so obvious to find the connections, and then something else will happen. So I think that I'm constantly looking for connections. And it happened decades ago when I was studying, when I got into theater, when I still had my academic background. There was just a desire to synthesize. So I think for me that desire to synthesize has been sort of a theme in my life.
Yeah. So, wow, you've just triggered a whole bunch of other questions for me. So I'll start with the first one that popped into my head, which is, the title of your talk is Getting Unstuck. Do you relate this feeling of stuckness to the experience that you just spoke about as frustration? Are those two things the same, or is there more to being stuck?
I think creativity is an ebb and flow of being stuck and being unstuck. I'm reminded right now of Feldenkrais's book, The Elusive Obvious. When we're in a state of flow, it feels like the most obvious thing in the world. And like, it's going to be with us forever. We're just inside of it and it's part of us. And then when we're out of it, we're out of it. And the process for me of creativity is that it is elusive. That if it was always there, we wouldn't have a practice. If it was always there, there would be no process to explore. So there is a relationship, what you just said, between being blocked, being stuck, and then being unstuck. And in that process of letting that ebb and flow happen is a practice. So I think there are connections.
So say more about the idea of a practice. I think that what happens with a lot of people who would like to be creative is that they come to this place, this block, this stuck, this place of frustration, and either keep banging their head against the same wall or just go, I'm not creative, I give up. What happens in that moment to make it a process or a flow?
I think that I think it's the ability, when we feel very inspired, or when we we start to get into a project, sometimes we get into a certain state that's not sustainable. We get excited about a project and we have an idea and we're inspired. And eventually we start to maybe feel a little too activated, a little bit too, like our feet aren't quite on the ground. And in our excitement, we get to maybe an overactivated state that is related to just not feeling. It's almost the feeling of having too much to say and not having anything to say at the same time. So for me, this process, and what was so revelatory about the Feldenkrais method was that although I had been studying physical approaches and incorporating that into my theater, my work with actors, and in my work with students, in sort of dropping into our bodies, the Feldenkrais method was a little bit different in that the other somatic practices that I studied and worked with were potentially creative and put me in a creative state and helped others go into a creative state. But with the Feldenkrais method, it felt like we were able to come back down, and not just come back down and settle into ourselves, but that there was a whole system to explore, and of really learning how to get to that quiet place, of learning how to deactivate. But not just that, because there's things like yoga and meditation that can get us there, and many somatic practices. But for me, the Feldenkrais method was also key in the underlying principles of not just lowering the noise, but also it's sort of like a radio. When you turn on an old radio, there's static. So there's things that can lower that static inside of ourselves, this internal noise, so we can hear ourselves more. But how do we enhance the music, right? So the Feldenkrais method and these underlying principles were really key in giving me suggestions and hints about how do we not just lower the static, but really sort of turn up our listening and be able to hear the music more. So, yeah.
So that's a great explanation of sort of an overview. I was wondering, do you feel that there are specific aspects of sort of the Feldenkrais, I don't want to call it pedagogy, but sort of our ideas that directly connect to the creative process? What did you discover as you started to connect with the Feldenkrais method? What did you discover about yourself that connected you to the creative process, besides the static, which is a really, really great thing, but learning principles or creative principles?
Right. So I won't go so much into the science of it. I'll start, I guess, maybe with a big picture example. So I think when I first started to study the Feldenkrais method, I really had some inkling that this was a very familiar thing to me. This is just on a pre-language level. I was like, this seems to be what I do all the time when I sit down and write, when I work with actors, directing, when I'm working with students, trying to get people out of their habits of that they might of writing, of how they express themselves, and it just felt very familiar. But a specific, maybe big picture example was in the training, there was just a sense that the overall training, I would sometimes just stop in the middle of an awareness through movement exercise where everybody's on the floor and there's like 40 or 50 people rolling around and sleeping and resting and moving very small, and just be kind of, I would sit up and just look around and be like, wow, this is exactly what I was trying to do all those years back in, rehearsal spaces and classrooms, in helping people get out of their own way and discover this other part of themselves, let this other part take over. So that was sort of the first big picture feeling of the overlaps between the creative process and how the Feldenkrais method teaches people to work with their body and their nervous system. And I guess two small examples might be that come to mind would be in theater, for example, when you're directing and you're working with actors, you never want to give somebody a line reading. You really try to avoid saying to an actor, okay, you're in a scene and say it like this, right? So you're cajoling people into coming up with it themselves and keeping it fresh, and also keeping it fresh for every performance. So you're creating a system in the rehearsal process, a whole system that each time they rehearse and each time they perform, they're discovering it anew. And they're discovering something a little bit different each time. So this thing about not going straight to something and really having to work within a system of people was very, very familiar. And a system of a person was very, very familiar. And I guess another example that is now very much in sense writing is that the first real underlying principle of Feldenkrais that I noticed that was very, very similar to how I worked and taught was working with constraints. And that relationship between working constraints and then taking those constraints away and seeing what's discovered and what kind of freedom is discovered, what kind of choice is discovered. So that relationship between constraints and freedom was something that I worked with for years. And that was like sort of like a right here when I first started to study the method. And so I was taken with those things that were kind of obvious, but meanwhile, there's many, many other things that were kind of connecting behind me while I was in the training.
I keep coming back to, even when you said constraints, that, you know, there's two kinds of constraints. There's the constraints that I create for myself, my invisible constraints that lead perhaps to this feeling of being stuck or frustrated. And then there's the constraints that are imposed by the lesson, you know, do the movement, but don't let your shoulder move, or try not to move your pelvis while your legs are moving, and then let your pelvis go while your legs are moving. And, two questions come up for me. How can a person in one of your workshops begin to see their own personal constraints? And then how do you use the idea of an imposed constraint sorry to give you all these two-part questions, but they just keep exploding. How do you use the principle of constraint going from a lesson to an exercise? So portion number one, how do you help people see their own constraints? Or maybe the two come together. I'll let you.
I think eventually for me, it's working with the second part first. And then that first part of your question comes in. So for example, I was working with constraints in writing for years, in sentence starters and these exercises that I would do with writers to get them inside and feeling contained and oriented in a setting, feeling contained and oriented in the body of a character. And the language of these constraints, it would be constraints in language of how you're writing. And then you would switch to free writing, whether that was into a scene or into a monologue. And so what I would do is I would take these writing constraints and have people experience in the sense writing workshops how it felt to write in constraints and how it felt to then go into a free write. And some people felt more freedom. Some people feel more freedom in the constraint writing, because they don't have to worry about what to write. Some people feel more freedom in the free write because the constraint was constraining, and then, oh wow, it opened up like a floodgate. And it always changes too. It's not consistent necessarily. It changes with the exercise. So then I would ask people to experience something, what like the examples that you just gave from an awareness through movement lesson. When you constrain an area that we're used to working with, let's say, you're going like this, and we're used to turning and looking and using our neck to turn, and we're constraining that. The beauty of constraints, it's forcing other parts of ourselves to come out. And then when we go and when we integrate and we're walking around, we can feel different parts of ourselves having sort of come out of the woodwork. Mm-hmm. So we're not going towards the habitual, right? We sort of like bypass that, and we're letting these other parts of ourselves come out. And it's the same thing when we put a writing constraint. Mm-hmm. So usually when we sit down to a blank page and we free write, and free writes are very, it's free writing is for the last few decades has been used to sort of dissolve blocks. You just sit at a blank page and you just let yourself go, and you don't judge and all these stuff, but truly, sometimes when you do a lot of free writing, it stops working. We get into our syntactical habits. We get into the same kind of writing every day or every morning in these free writes. It's like watching somebody free dance, but they're kind of free dancing in the same movements all the time. So how do we really allow freedom in writing? By introducing the pre-writing of constraints or other principles of sense writing beforehand. And it's the same thing with the movement. So if we ask somebody to just walk freely or dance freely, it's like giving them a blank page and saying free write. So so once people really get it into their bones, this practice of writing and then moving and writing and moving and reflecting on that. So there's always reflection. There's always written reflection of like, okay, how did it feel to write into that scene that, in your novel or in your story or in your article? How did it feel to write into that scene with the constraints and the free write? And then how did it feel, which felt easier, which felt more frustrating, which felt more annoying? And so there's a dialogue, a self-dialogue that starts to develop in this relationship between constraints and freedom. And then people will then do the movement, and they'll do that kind of same reflection. And then they'll start to make the connections on their own between the writing and the movement. And then it brings us to the second part of your question, is then they start to really understand the constraints and the blocks that they put on themselves and how to work with them, and how to accept them and work around them and let other things take over, and not go straight to the block like, oh, I'm not a good writer, I'm not creative, or I start things, I don't finish them, or all the things that sort of when you go straight to a block. Or there's a really difficult thing that I want to write about, and I don't want to write about anything else, and every time I write towards it, I feel like anxiety and I walk away. So it's about learning how to work with then the personal blocks that you just brought up.
So it's really interesting what you brought up about the difference between, free writing, free dancing. In both of those things, I realized as you were talking that we default to our habitual attitudes and postures when we're faced with a blank canvas or we're faced with blank choreography. Mm-hmm. And, it just never occurred to me that in an awareness through movement lesson, you're being guided, you're being directed. It's not just lie on the floor and feel yourself and just move around, but every part of it is directing you and supporting you in the process of your awareness development, which then brings me the question, as someone who has done these workshops, I'm sure that there are lessons that you have found are particularly useful, or maybe sequences that you find are particularly useful to help people come up against some of these principles, whether it's opening oneself up or dealing with constraints. Can you talk a little bit about that? Are there particular, I mean, do you do a full out, full length awareness through movement lesson? How do you put it together for people?
I know that, Feldenkrais famously said, there are no principles. The only principle to the method is that there are no principles. And I think that he was really protecting the method at a time when it was a different time. And I think he was a pioneer in what he was doing. And I think we've become more sophisticated, that we can work within principles and let them go, and work within principles and let them go. So I think he was protecting the method from mechanistic reductive kind of questions and thinking that I knew quite well because he was a scientist. So I was, besides the constraints and the freedom and working with that principle, as I was putting them together, and really many, many principles, it's really like infinitely yielding in principles, the Feldenkrais method, and how it connects to creativity. So in sense writing, there's 5 principles that I work with, and I'm very explicit with, like, okay, so this is what we'll be doing in this beginner workshop, and then and this is what we'll be doing. These are the principles we're working on in this intermediate workshop. And of course, all these principles spiral. You're spiraling through them eventually, and then the advanced sense writing students are like, all the principles are really the same. They're all like, and they're like, yeah, but but it allows us to be contained. Again, we're looking for ways of containing and orienting in something that feels very vast. And when we can orient and contain ourselves, then we can deal with the vastness, which is a lot of what creativity is. We feel so much connection, but then we can feel overwhelmed. So the principles contain us, and they allow us to rest inside of them. So what I do in terms of awareness through movement, I'll usually allow people, or I usually introduce, not all the time, but I'll introduce a principle without really talking about it in a writing sequence. So people can, and then people will reflect on it, and people will talk about and discuss it in partners, or on the online course, they'll talk about it in the Facebook group, or when we do a live workshop. And then I'll start talking about the principle. So it's always about experience first, practice first, and then theory later. So then I'll talk about the principle. So people are making the connections before I really talk. So they're making the connections in a writing sequence, and then we'll go into a movement sequence, where the movement sequence, the awareness through movement, will be something that illustrates that specific. Of course, it's illustrating many principles, but I'm really highlighting maybe one principle, and then they reflect on that, and already the connections are being made between the writing and the movement with this principle, and then we talk about it, and then we name it. So that, and the awareness through movements are really modified. I don't really lead people through 45-minute or 1 hour movement sequences. It's usually in ebb and flow. Let's say one sense writing sequence can be even just 30 minutes of a writing and then a movement, or the more complex, more advanced sequences might be an hour long, where it might be writing and then 30 minutes of an awareness through movement, and then 10 more minutes of writing. So it really depends on what the focus is and what we're highlighting, because it really goes on two levels. So when we go to a regular writing workshop, it's all about the product. And we workshop our stuff, and we talk about craft, and we talk about character and setting and conflict, and we're getting feedback. And so what the sense writing workshops are different is sort of I've inverted. I've made product, we don't really focus so much on product in the beginning, we focus on process, because that's what has been, I feel, kind of neglected, and people really avoid talking about process. So I highlight process, and the product is, it's a very generative process, so product comes. And working on these two levels of process and product, it sort of takes away a lot more. It's like we get to focus on the process, and the product is sort of this beautiful byproduct of what we're doing. So instead of being like, oh, this is, I'm writing the most important thing of my life, our inner fingers are just going to cripple, sort of like seize up if we try to do that. So we're really just looking at process, looking at these connections, what we feel before and after in this kind of self-reflective, self-empirical practice and process. And then, the product comes, and then we start to look at craft also. So by working on these two levels, we really sort of it helps take the pressure off. And yeah.
So I don't know, is it secret, these principles? Are
No,
you
they're
divulge any of the principles so that we can get a taste?
Sure. So, well, one of them is constraints and freedom, and the relationship between them. And then another one that we work a lot with in the beginning is containment and orientation. So how do we feel contained in our own body? When we feel contained in our own body, what happens in terms of letting our internal landscape, what happens in terms of letting the invisible become more visible when we feel containment, right?
So it's interesting, you just brought up something, and we'll keep going, but you just brought up this idea of my inner landscape, which so much relates to the theme of our entire series, in the sense of the map is the territory. Are you saying that, so some people, when they think of containment, they think of a prison or being held in versus equality. Can you just speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, containment has to do with boundaries and safety. So Feldenkrais talks about, or he writes about, how every living organism to grow has to have a boundary. Skin, each organ, in order to grow. So I feel like when we have that sense of overwhelm and vastness that kind of visits us, it can be great and inspiring, but eventually we're running on fumes, and that we get, instead of that feeling of having too much and nothing to say, sometimes at the same time. So what I mean by containment is that we feel safe and we can sink into where we are, and our internal landscape then gently starts to come to us, starts to become more visible. We can start to feel and process and absorb more sensation. And when we feel and process and absorb more sensation, we have more real choices. Right? Not the overwhelming choices of an American supermarket of like, which breakfast cereal should I choose? But it's they're real connected, felt choices. And it's like, when we feel that that increased visibility inside of our internal landscape, that skill is what we're bringing into any landscape. So any landscape of memory and any landscape of imagination. Mm-hmm. So that's a second principle of containment, and then and how it's related to orienting, how we can then feel oriented in a setting, in a story, in a larger project. Another very, very, very generative principle is differentiation and integration. So, when we workshop anything, or it's in any creative genre, you're workshopping. You bring in a painting or a sculpture or a chapter of a book, and people will talk about craft. All together. Maybe a class will focus on conflict or external conflict or internal conflict. So there's a little bit of differentiation, but you're still writing everything together. And some part of you is like, oh, focus on just the conflict, because this is what we're learning about. But what we do in sense writing is we actually take a piece of paper and we divide it into columns where we just write into one element of craft, and then we switch. We just write into, let's say, a setting with a constraint, and then we just write into action of the same scene with a constraint, and then we just maybe write the dialogue. So we're letting these elements that are usually fused together and clumped together as we write, we're letting them separate and refine. Mm-hmm. And then when we go and integrate and we do the free writing into that scene thing, we just have more choices. And it's the same thing with a Feldenkrais Awareness Through Movement lesson, right? We're differentiating different movements so that we can then let it go, forget that we ever did that. And then when we start to walk around and do, and move, the smarter part of ourselves has deep, connected, refined choices that it could make. And things are not clumped together anymore. So that's and then a couple of other ones that are more in the advanced lessons are articulated sensitivity, and then which again is just finding more and more complexity and being able to build the capacity for more complexity and choices to build larger projects. And then the last one is non-habitual flow. And that's just like all the principles just spiraling through, and that you're just in this flow that is playful and surprising. Mm-hmm. So those are the 5 principles of sense writing.
Great. So fun. So as I was listening to you, I was thinking to myself, is there, and maybe there's not a real official answer to this, but is it possible that when a person is in the throes of writer's block, that instead of just sitting there and continuing to try to write, that it would just make sense to lie down and do an awareness through movement lesson? Do you think that would help?
100%, yeah.
Is that something that you've tried?
But like, how hard is that? It's the hardest thing in the world. I say all the time that lying down on the floor is like the most subversive act, because it's like when we're in the throes of like, oh, this is terrible. I'm wrestling with something, and I'm gonna get through it. We're on a track, and it's so hard then to let that go and to lie down. It's really hard to leave the narrative of our struggle. It's really hard to leave the forward momentum of our life and lie down. So yes, there's a lot of body mapping in sense writing.
Right. I love this term that you just used, the narrative of our struggle. How we are, our habitual our habits also include the habit of suffering, of torturing myself while looking at my blank page. is actually a habit. And what you're saying is simply the act, the subversive act of lying down, is an interruption of that habitual behavior.
Yep. Yeah, I feel this really strongly. I feel this very strongly because I taught at NYU, and I was very involved in theater, and also, you know, just the art community, and that struggle and the suffering artist it's a cultural habit, and it's a habit in our bodies, and on the most personal, intimate level, it becomes what we are. And so I think that's what really, for myself and for students, I was just looking around and nobody was really addressing process and addressing the deeper anxieties and blocks that I noticed, and a deeper issue of how struggle, especially with being an artist, is so accepted and internalized. So when I say that, lying down is a subversive act, it really is, you know, for everyone and for artists.
Do you think that this suffering artist thing and this struggling thing and this inability to get past the block, I suddenly, as you were talking and you mentioned the word anxieties about your students, how much of this is connected with fear of failure? And, you know, the feeling of like, well, if I actually finish what I've written and it sucks, then if I never finish it, I'll never know, right? And if I do finish it and people don't like it, then that must mean it's no good. And so therefore I'll just keep on acting as if I want to try to finish it. And that relationship with, you know, sort of what we say in Feldenkrais of investing in failure, that part of creativity maybe is not being afraid to fail. Do you address that at all?
That's a good question. I guess it's two parts. First of all, like the theater community that I was a part of and the theater that I was doing was very invested in failure. You know, the Beckett quote of, you know, fail again, fail better. We really were exploring the debris that's left with failure and going into it and seeing what was there in language and performance. So I think I have a natural affinity to just being in mistakes, and but in terms of the performance of writing, there's a couple of parts maybe in that answer. The first would be that I guess with sense writing, what I'm also trying to address is by putting the focus and the emphasis on process, where we're avoiding that situation where people are writing, or we're learning how to avoid that situation where people are writing, you know, just to show what they've written and just to get the feedback and just to learn, you know, hear what the teacher says. Because what I noticed is that when I was a student and when I was a teacher, that there was that excitement, and I loved bringing my stuff in, you know, to get workshopped. But there was that anxiety. And there was not just that anxiety, but when it was my turn to give feedback, there was anxiety of performance as well. Like, what am I going to say something like supportive, but smart enough? And is the professor going to agree with me? So there's all these levels of performance. And I remember, even though I tried not to do that, but when I had my own writing workshops at university, like that, it was still there. So there is, I think what you say, there's a lot of truth to that, like the fear of failure. And so that we really, especially in the sense writing process, we're really lowering expectations. And I think Feldenkrais is beautiful at lowering expectations. I mean, you're really doing this for like 5 minutes. Like, what can your expectation be about that? You know, or like writing in a constraint. It's all about, you can't write, when you're writing with sentence starters, like, I remember, and you're just repeating that, or I don't remember, and you're just repeating that, or you're just writing, you know, just in this one way, you can't really show off. You can't really, oh, this is so beautiful. You're just, it lowers expectations on yourself. And then when you go to the free write, you're already in that mode of lowered expectation that things just start to come. But what I also love about Feldenkrais is that it's deep in the way that it's not so psychological. So I don't have to get too much in the stories of in my head of like, I'm always putting myself down as a writer, or, you know, I didn't have support as a child in my creative life, so I'm not creative now, and how am I going to get out of that? And it allows us to go before all those narratives, before all those stories that we've told ourselves about ourselves, and we're lying down, and what we're really doing is maybe going into a deeper place where those stories have attached to deeper activations, that and we're dealing with the activations themselves, and we're letting those dissolve. Because I think what sometimes happens is we have the activations, and then we let, you know, the stories sort of come and they glom onto the physiological, sensorial feelings that we have. And so what I love about the Feldenkrais method is it does allow us to get into that place before all this. I think Ruti Alan writes about that in her book, Mindful Spontaneity, that allows us to go to a place before all the stories that, you know, that we've told about ourselves. So again, it's sort of this before language, before story place that the method allows us to go into, and that gives us more resiliency to handle the stories that do come our way and want to attach to us about fear of failure and you know, those more psychological narratives that we tell ourselves, that, and it just gives us a little bit more padding.
So it's interesting, as you were speaking, I thought about the famous Feldenkrais quote, making the impossible possible, the possible easy, and the easy elegant. And it sounds like in your workshops, you start with what's easy, give people a sense, or maybe start with what's possible, so that they don't even have to think about the impossible. Would you say that that's kind of where you go? Do you go towards the impossible in the advanced workshops?
Slowly build towards it. Yeah, I think it's that you sort of go like this, and you're not even aware that you're going like this, because
right.
as we go, the sequences become more complex. They start to support larger work, more sophisticated craft questions, connections between connections and themes, and larger, more abstract questions. But we do start, so it's sort of this an emphasis on ease and complexity together, you know, as we sort of build larger, more ambitious projects that don't put us in sometimes what comes with ambition.
So it's like, you know, suddenly a person realizes that they're writing something that they wouldn't have thought was possible when they began to study with you. So for me, it's like looking at your workshop as a gigantic awareness through movement lesson. Mm-hmm. Just like when all of a sudden you're rolling around with no hands and you never rolled before, and it's easy and it's elegant, right? So how wonderful to think of anything in life as, you know, looking at the structure of an awareness through movement lesson, which
That's
is great.
Right.
Which kind of brings me to my next question for you, which is, you know, I mean, obviously you're embodying the Feldenkrais principles into your life. How has it affected your writing process? And have you changed how you write, what you write, because of your experience in Feldenkrais and teaching?
I think my writing I was always very process oriented. I grew up, I think because I grew up in New York, and then I escaped New York and I went up to Montreal, and I was in a place where, at a time, a certain time period, especially in that city, it was just a very joie de vivre place where people didn't work a lot, and there was a real enjoyment of life. And I started to notice like the art there was amazing. And there was a real emphasis on the body. I wasn't studying theater. I was doing a little bit, but I wasn't studying it. There was an emphasis, though, on physical theater, probably because of the language conflict. And this was a way of sort of going around that conflict of movement and physical theater. And when I went back to New York after school, I was always noticing just how busy everybody was and how activated everybody was and how product focused they were. And this is in my 20s, and I was seeing a lot of theater and feeling like, I don't know, like the quality is great sometimes, and sometimes I felt like, again, like this gap between process and product. So I was always trying to remind myself of process. But I think in my own writing, I got away from that. Once you start to be in a professional world, and it's very hard to keep reminding yourself of that by yourself when there's no ground underneath you and nobody else is doing it. So or few people are doing it, I should say. And it's so competitive. So I think I was like drifting away from that. But longing for it. And I think that for me, it was really an important personal step, and to devote so much time to the method and to the synthesis in sense writing. And now, absolutely, like now I come to my work differently. When I know, like I just know that when I'm writing from that place of overactivation and like I feel hyper and not like my feet are not on the ground, I let myself be there. But then like in a couple of days, I know that I'll be just doing some body mapping, awareness through movement, some other things that I do, and just getting into a much, just leaving things and going for a walk, coming back. I'll be in a space that's just so much more yielding, and I'll be doing the sense writing sequences, and it just becomes much. I'm like, oh, this is reminding me, So sometimes I'm in that state for a couple of days, and then I come out of that state, and then I have this other place to go. That is, I sort of talk about that you're developing like what's the word that I use, but it's just sort of like a relationship, or you're becoming your own muse, but you're developing a good relationship with your muse rather than just like, some romance. when is the muse going to come? It's more of a solid relationship that you can call it and beckon it without it, and it's not so fickle. Yeah.
So interesting that you bring up the muse, right? And how we have this attitude that the muse is something that we call from outside of ourselves, instead of it being a resource that I draw from within myself, or, and it's not like it's hiding. It's something that I am creating the interference in some way.
Yeah.
So the question that comes up for me is, as wonderful as it is to explore process and be in process and the value of that process, how do you know when you have a product? I mean, for those people who do write professionally, or for people who are trying to finish something that they've been working on a long time, how do you come to a product? Or is that outside the scope of our talk?
I mean, I think it's like, as in any workshop, you sort of just, at some point, you know that you have, you know, we do talk about structure eventually, and we do talk about beginning, middle, and ends, and all of that stuff gets layered in. So though we're focusing on process, craft follows process. And then we start to have intrinsic, we start to be able to see the, if you're coming from a connected place and you're writing, then the craft that is intrinsic to it. And you start to be able to identify the craft that's intrinsic. So you start to be able to see the beginning, middle, and ends. You start to be able to see, oh, that is the desire that's emerging from the character. How is that going to, you know, oh, that's a choice. That's the action. You start to be able to identify those elements of craft, and let the piece speak to you in a clear way that requires less drafts, you know, because there's less noise. So I think it's like in any workshop, at some point, you know, you have a sense of completion. And so there's many students who have taken sense writing, and they're journalists, they're filmmakers, they're writing larger pieces, they're writing novels. And so it's not a generative free process. It's really contained within eventually seeing the intrinsic structures that come out.
Yeah. And so in the more advanced workshops, do you address craft, or then do they go on to other places?
Well, actually, in the beginning workshops, we address craft.
Oh, okay.
So if, you know, we address craft in the 12-week online workshop, and even just in the first weekend live workshops that I give, the first day we talk about constraints and freedom, we talk about process. The second day we look at how process leads to craft. So we just start to see the intrinsic craft that's sort of emerging organically, and then how to kind of work with that.
And are you writing anything right now? Are you thinking about writing a book about this process, maybe?
Well, there's a lot of information. I've been writing about this process, and it's a little bit meta for me, and it was difficult. It's like to write about things that are elusive, to write about things that start before language, really start in a place before language, is difficult, you know. And as Feldenkrais said, he's like, you know, how do you describe the taste of a mango to somebody who has never eaten a mango, you know? So for the last 6 years, I've been really, really writing about sense writing. And that brought, sort of from that is the sense writing course, which is the online course. And that's really comprehensive, and takes you through 3.5 of the 5 principles, let's say. Four of the 5 principles. So now that online course has its own, you know, life, I'm writing more for myself, which feels great. And so I have a reading of a play that's coming up in the beginning of the summer. I'm working with in New York, and I'm working with actors here in Tel Aviv on another play that I wrote a little while ago. So, yeah.
Oh, that's really exciting. And it's what I think is really important that you just said is that, you know, some people have an idea that it's only writing if it's a book or a play or an article. But every time that you're working through a process of something as a teacher, and I'm speaking specifically also to all of the Feldenkrais teachers out there, even as you construct a workshop that you're giving, that process, that creative process is the same as if you're writing something. It's all the things that you just talked about relate to any creative process, not just writing a book or a play or something like that.
Right.
So that's very valuable, that in a sense, your sense writing course is like a major oeuvre if we looked at it from the perspective of a book, and that you've created this course that other people will then be able to take because you have found a way to create that flow. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a beautiful way of describing, like, when you're in a theater, all the actors, the writer, the director is creating experience, and it's a collaboration, but they're invested in your experience and the shifts and the changes or whatever transformation might happen that might be slight or large. When you're looking at a piece of art, like, the artist is creating an experience, a moment-to-moment experience. And it's not controllable, but it's a moment-to-moment experience. That's what a Feldenkrais teacher is doing too. Just sequencing an experience that isn't controllable, and it's a collaboration,
Right.
Yeah.
Beautiful. That's great. So is there anything else that you wanted to add about anything before we come to a close? We've sort of touched a little bit about your new workshop series that's coming up, which, by the way, people who are interested or want to know more, you can just go to feldenkrais.com and go to Madelyn's profile page, and you can learn about the workshops that are coming up that she's doing. Do you want to add anything before we sort of wrap things up?
I think that's it. I think, yeah, so I do, I teach in different cities all over the world now, but I just teach like the introduction workshop, and the most comprehensive way of kind of stepping into this whole thing is through that 12-week course, which now anybody can try and be a part of the course from anywhere in the world. And that was a big goal of mine, because I was traveling so much and teaching different levels in different cities. And now it's something that anybody anywhere can take. So
yeah, that's really, isn't it wonderful that we live, I always say it's great living in the future. Who would have thought that we'd be able to do this? So I just want everyone to know that this talk will be up within a couple of hours. So if you felt that the material was so rich that you couldn't absorb it all at once, you can tune in after that. It'll be up for at least another 48 hours for free. And of course, while you're watching that, you're trying to watch all the other ones. So if you decided right now that you wanted to buy the all access pass, you would actually get a $25 discount, all of the talks, 27 transcripts, all of the awareness through movement lessons. I mean, it's quite a deal. Plus, a lot of the speakers have bonus packages, including Madelyn has a bonus package in hers that offers some of these sense writing exercises for you to be able to try. So you don't want to miss out on all of those different opportunities. And then do make sure to stay with us, because after this talk, we're going to be going into a live panel discussion on creativity with our experts who have been reviewing these different talks. And so it would be great to have you as part of that as well. Madelyn, thank you. It's been such an honor to meet you and speak to you about a process that's very close to my heart, and I know to many, many people. We all want to be creative souls. Thanks again for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Lavinia. Thank you so much.
And maybe someday we'll see each other live and in person.
Right.
Okay, take care.
Bye. Thanks so much, everyone.